Welcome csc121 class. I'm going to review EX3 hex letters. This is the one where we did our data challenge over and threw in some if statements just to kind of introduce conditional statements a little bit. But first of all, let me show you what it does. It worked fine up to a certain point. And what this was a way to input RGB numbers and get hex numbers. So if we run this thing and we put in something like 23, which is RGB, and we hit enter, we get a hex number of 16s and 1s. So that's the hex number of 23. If we run it again and we try something like 128, which is right in the middle, we get an 8 and a 0. And then what we did is we did these conversions so that if the 16s is 10 or more, instead of putting like a 10 or 11 or 12, it'll use this letter. And then when we run it again and put in 160, we're getting an error. Now the error says it's having a problem with this line down here. This is the one we were trying to put in something to catch it if someone put a number over 255. And the greater than sign is causing a problem because it's saying not supported between instances of string and int. You might say, why is that? Well, if we run into anywhere where these evaluate as true, where we just did 160, it will give 16s the value of a, which is a string. But then since these are multiple ifs, it'll go down here and it'll still try to evaluate this. And because it's a greater than sign, you can evaluate equals equals whether it's a string or an integer. But because it's a greater than sign, that's kind of forcing it to be math. And it won't know what to do if you have a string value like a. It's still going to try to check, well, is a greater than 15? And it's going to get confused and it's going to do this. That's why we just did this real quick. That's why all of these should really have elif, so that it's only evaluating once. With the multiple ifs, it keeps going through and evaluating. That's fine sometimes when you try it out. You can do multiple ifs, but in this case, if you use the elifs, which is another condition, it won't bother evaluating the other elif statements. So if it meets one of the conditions of turning it into a letter, it won't bother going to the evaluation that tries to evaluate if it's greater than 15 or not, creating that error. So if we run it again, we could see what happens. So if I run and I put in 255, which should evaluate to that, it's not going to go on and do the next one. But if this was an if, it keeps going on. So that's where that ran into a problem. And that's good to know because that'll help us as we work with if and elif and else conditions, because sometimes they work with all ifs and sometimes you don't need an elif and an else. But this is one case where it definitely does because it's converting it into a string and then it's trying to evaluate something as an integer and we're running into errors. So we're going to think about that as we go through this exercise. So I'm going to go through this exercise and I'm going to go back to an original one that I just started. And we'll start this from scratch just to go over it in case you weren't in class or in case you were in class and maybe you didn't understand everything that was going on. So this is the original we did on my first video. And one thing I mentioned is I should put RGB here because it doesn't make sense because we're putting in an RGB number. Why call that hex name? So I'll change all these to RGB because that's what we're putting in. We're putting in RGB. Matter of fact, we're not putting in RGB name, we're putting RGB num. So let's make this more semantic so it makes sense to what we're doing. So we're putting in an RGB number and then we're trying to convert it to a hex value from the RGB number. So now we have RGB number. Now one thing we did on our new version is instead of just putting a number here and changing it, we're using an input function. So we could say input and let anybody put in whatever number they want. So we're going to input and then in the parentheses here put a string and say enter RGB number, and we could put the number sign or put in parentheses from 0 to 255, and I'll put a colon and a space and I'll spread this out so you can see it a little better. I'll close this up. So this is our input. So we're saying this variable RGB num is going to be assigned to whatever someone inputs after this prompt. So we're hoping they're going to put in a number. But keep in mind that an input actually returns a string. So if we did this right now, and I ran it, and I put in any number, I'll put in 128 just to start, I get an error because it says unsupported operand, because this is coming as a string, and then we're doing math. So we're not allowed to use string. Even though we typed in a number, it's coming through as the number that's coming out is really this. When I type in 128, it's reading that value as this. And then it's trying to do math with it and it's getting confused. So we don't want to do that. So we have to convert it to an integer. So we could do it on one line, or I'll just show you on a separate line right now. I'm just going to say RGB. I'll just reassign it. I'll say RGB num equals. So this is a reassignment, and I'm just going to put int, and then I'm going to run the int function and just put RGB num in here. And that'll just do the conversion on a second line. You could do it up here. You could do this. You could click right in front of the input and type int and open a parentheses, and then at the end close it so that the whole input is enclosed in the int function. That's one way to do it, but I did this kind of on 2 lines just so you'd understand what was happening initially. But eventually you'd probably put that on 1 line. But we're putting it on the second line here, so it's doing the conversion to an integer right here. And that's very important because it's taking the string that even if whatever you put in here, a number, a word, whatever, it's converting it to an integer. Now if you typed in a word, you're going to get an error too. So that's something we'll have to deal with in the future. But right now, if we run this now, it should work if you put in a number from 0 to 255, even if you put in a number higher. So if I put in 234, it's working, except it's doing 14 and 10. We're going to try to convert any number that's 10 or over to the letters, to the hex letters. So this would be A and this would be E, because the numbers of hex are A is 10, B is 11, C is 12, D is 13, E is 14, and F is 15. That's the way hex works. So it only uses 1 digit. So once it goes over 9, we're going to be using letters. So we don't have that right now, but it's working the way we want it to work. So if I run it again with our input, even if I put in 255, it works. Matter of fact, even if I put in something over 255, 278, it'll still work. It's still doing the math. It's still giving you the number of 16s, and it's still giving you a remainder. Although that's not really hex, and we want to keep it in this area. So what we introduced, just to start, it's a little premature getting into conditional statements, but we thought we'd try it just so it looks nicer, because the if statement is fairly easy, and we're going to do it in front of the print. And I think what I also did here, instead of using the commas, I'm going to do this because we were working with the f string method where we can put an f here, and then we put this whole thing as a string, and then we don't need a comma. That way, it's very easy to put something like a pound sign in here because it treats that like a string. And we could put these together. We don't have to worry about the comma putting a space. So if I outputted it right now and I put in 255, it's saying 1515 and it's putting it right together and it's putting the pound sign. That's kind of the way hex looks, except we don't want 1515. It would be FF. So we have to put some conditions in here, and we're going to do it real primitive to start. We're just going to go in here and we'll try one. We'll say if, we're going to use an if condition. It's going to run this if condition before it gets to the print. And the way this works in Python, we could say something like if 16s, we'll deal with the 16s first, and we'll say if, and we'll have to put equals equals, because that is testing equality. We don't want to use equals. That's for assigning variables. This is for testing equality. And you don't need the spaces in here. You could do it like that. And I'm going to say if 16 equals equals, and the first number over 9 is 10, so we'll say 10, and we have to put a colon here because this is a condition, and then it's waiting for what's next. So then if we hit our return or our enter, it's going to indent it and make it part of this block. This is part of a conditional block. So I'm going to put in what's going to happen if it's 10. Well, if 16s is 10, I'm actually going to change 16s. We're going to change the same thing, and we're going to change it to be A. And that should work. We're using an if condition. So we're kind of catching it here and saying, okay, if it's 10, then use A. We're not saying if it's over or doing anything like that yet. We're just catching 1 because we only have like 5 to catch here. So if we run this, and we did something where we know there's 10, just for example, if it's 160, because we know 16 goes in there 10 times. If we did this and put 160, that works. It makes A 0. There's A, which is 10 16s, and 0 1. So that actually works. So we know this works. And when we did it in class, we just copied these and we did a whole bunch of if statements. We can get away with multiple ifs, but after I do this, I'll make sure we go and make it elif. And I have to unindent all these ifs. And let's see, so I just copied and pasted all of these, and I'll change these to B, I'll change this to C, I'll change this to D, I'll change this to E, and we still have one more. We have the F. And notice when I hit return every time, it is indenting because it's expecting to keep it part of the block. That's why I have to go back and unindent, if you see that happening. And I'll put this as F. So this should work here. All these multiple ifs should work if we go through and do this. So I'm going to do 160 again. and that works. Now, if I run it again and try something like 255 that has a remainder of 15, I'm going to run into a problem because we didn't do the ones yet. It's still doing this like 15, 15. So I'm still running into a problem here with 250. Well, actually, I ran into a lot of problems because I didn't change these yet. So I have to make sure I change these. But this should work. Make sure you change all these, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, A through F. So I'll run it again, and I'll put in 255. And the F works, but it's still making the ones 15. So that means I have to make all the ones 15. And let me copy this. I'll show you it's not that hard to change this. I'll just copy this whole block and paste it, because when it's in blue like that, it'll wipe it out. And now I have to make all these ones, and what you could do is you could highlight, and if I'm on a Mac, I could hold Command, and if I'm on Windows, I could hold Control, and I'm just going to hold down either Command or Control. If you're in Windows, it would be Control, and I'll double click on all of these, and it'll highlight all of these variables, all of the 16s, because I want to change them all, and I want to change them all to be ones. And ones is going to work the same way. If it's 10, it's going to be A. Those will all work the same way. So we're just doing these multiple conditional statements. And again, they say if, and then you put your condition. If your condition is if 16s equals this number or is equivalent, that's what this means, is equivalent to that number, then you're going to reassign the variable. So don't do this. Make sure you don't put a double equals here. It'll just kind of ignore that. Make sure that you're reassigning it. You're saying, okay, now 16s is going to be A. And same thing down here. If it was just like we did right here, if it's 255, it's going to say, okay, if the remainder is 15, then ones is now going to be equal to F, and that's what it's going to put down here, and that's what it's going to print out. So if I run this right now, and I put in 255, it should come out to FF. And it does. So it's working. And then what we said is, well, let's put in something if we go over 15. And if we put in something like this, and we just put another if statement, we thought, oh, let's make it if 16s is greater than 15, then we're going to say 16s equals number too high, or number over 250, or something like that. Just almost like an error message we're doing there. And then also, if that's going to happen, we thought, well, why don't we say the ones is equal to nothing? We'll just put empty quotes here. So basically, you're saying the ones is nothing. Nothing will show up there, and the 16s will say number over 255. So if you put a number over 255, it'll work, or it should work, based on this. So if something divides into that and it goes 16 or 17 or anything like that, it should work. We'll run this right now. And if I put in a really high number, someone's just messing around and puts 456, this works. That works fine. It says number over 255, ones becomes blank. But if you do something like this, where you put in 254, you get an error. And that's because even though this is working, it's converting 16s to F, because F would still go in there 15 times. But then it's still trying to evaluate this expression or this condition where it says greater than 15, and then that's where it's coming up with that error. So to avoid this, what we could do here is we could make these all elifs. And that is probably more appropriate in this case. And when we formally learn about these, well, that's the way we'll do it anyway. We just kind of did it real quick with just the multiple F's. But that's good to know the difference between them. And again, we're not going to use else. You might say, well, what if we use else? We got to be careful, because if we use else, it might evaluate anything that's under, and we don't want to change anything that's under. We want to keep it the number. So that's why we're not doing an else. And all of these, notice we're keeping the first one if, and then we'll just do all the elif. That basically means else if. That's what it means in Python. Some other languages say if else or else if, but we're going to do elif because that's the way Python does it. So we're going to do this. Now what happens before we get to the ones, if this wipes it out here, then it won't evaluate any of these. So we don't have to worry about that. So if we make these all elif, so for these we're going to start with if and then do all elifs so that it skips over it. So if it's not true, it just skips over it and moves to the next one, and that's what's going to happen there. And same thing here. This is more of the appropriate way of doing it, and this should fix this little error here. So I'm going to run it, and let me just try 255, and that works. And I'm going to run it again, and let's try number over 255, like 256. And that works. So we're not running into that problem where it's trying to say 15 goes into there. So we're doing okay with that, and it's not doing anything with the ones. It's doing that. It's not evaluating any of these. It's printing it out okay. So everything's okay. The only problem we would still have, we haven't anticipated everything. What if you just type in something like that? You're going to get an error because it's not going to know what to do with a string. So that's something we could deal with in the future. But for right now, in our hex letters here, this is working because we ran into an error here with something over 255. And it was actually a good learning experience to learn what happens, and even for myself, because I've used multiple ifs in the past, but this was one situation where the multiple ifs run into a problem because it's creating a conflict between a string and an integer. So again, what we're doing here is we're inputting, converting to an integer, and then we're putting a value. We're running our formula here that's really saying how many times does 16 go into that number without giving a remainder. So that whole number only goes in there. How many times does that whole number 16 go into that number? And then this one is only the remainder after dividing by 16. So that's what's happening there. We're getting the remainder, and that's how we figure out hex, except if we go over the number 9, we have to use letters, and we don't want to go over 15 either. That's why we put this little statement down here just to protect us, but we're not protecting everything. We're not protecting people putting in text and things like that. We're not protecting people putting in negative numbers. We're assuming people are going to put in an actual RGB number, and we could put in other kind of protective measures if they go below, if they're put in a negative number and things like that. And if they do put in a string, we can do that. But for now, we're just kind of introducing some of this. So this was our brief little introduction to conditional statements, and we're going to do this more formally, but I just wanted to go over this first. If you were in class and some of it seemed confusing, especially when we ran into the error there, or if you're just not sure how this works, or if you missed class, hopefully this helps a little bit with this hex letter conversion. We'll do more with this, but I just wanted to go over this one more time.